recognition. Well, good morning. It's nice to be back. I have been here multiple times over the years. I'm Denise Merrill, Secretary of the State.
Let's see if the switch is on.
Oh. Better? Yeah, yes. There we go. So, sorry to delay things. I had to wait for my reading glasses. I'm sure some of you will appreciate that. I have been in office in Connecticut for almost 30 years now, in various capacities. This is my third term as Secretary of the State. And just so you know, I'll give you my credentials, if you will. I was past president of the National Association of Secretaries of State in 2016. It was momentous, I will say that. And since that time, I was the first co-chair of the Department of Homeland Security's Coordinating Committee on Election Security, which was all new to all of us in 2017 when we found out that Connecticut was one of 17 states that there had been an attempted hack of our voter registry. You may have read about it. I also like to recall for the audience, I know it's a kind of a partisan crowd, but I like to remind everyone that I was elected by my peers when I was majority leader in the House as most respected by the other side of the aisle. And I'm very proud of that, actually. And I think in these times, it's important to remember that the country has to come together in the end, no matter what happens with this 2020 election. And yes, I am terribly worried about the results of all the things that have been done to divide us in the last 4 years since our last election. And I've learned a lot about it. I never thought I'd be someone who has, for example, security clearance to go to top secret meetings with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. I'm a kid from the 60s, and so this is all sort of different for me. But I have made it a hallmark of my administration that I'm making it easier for voters to be able to vote. I really have modernized our elections in many ways, and I do believe that we owe it to the voters to be kind of like a customer service thing. We should make it a pleasurable experience. And I feel like what we need is everyone to be voting. Every eligible voter in this state should be voting, and every eligible voter should be registered to vote. And that's been quite an effort over the last 8 or 9 years that I've been secretary, and I think we've come a long way, honestly. I also think it has been a hallmark of what we've been doing in the last decade that we have made the voting experience more standardized across all the many, many small towns that we have actually administering the vote in this country. And you know, it was very difficult to explain to people exactly how elections worked over the last 4 years because no one ever asked before. Honestly, for hundreds of years, we've been voting and people had great faith in the American elections, an almost touching faith in the American elections. We feel strongly about elections, we Americans. And I think the fact that it's been administered at a fairly local level, even now in the era of electronics, gives people comfort. I can still remember when we put the first voter ID law in place. It was actually about 20 years ago, one of my first elections. And I remember people were angry that they were asking them for their ID. They're like, Maud, you've known me for 30 years. Why are you asking me for my driver's license, right? So Connecticut's really been at the forefront of a lot of improvements in elections for quite a long time. It predates me, really. And we are routinely evaluated on our election process very highly. The Pew Foundation, for example, the last time they did an evaluation of American state elections, rated Connecticut, I think we were number 5 in the country, for our process. Because we use all the best practices. We have paper ballots. We have audits of the paper ballots afterwards, required by law, not on request of a candidate who lost. We have checks and balances at every level of government, from the local on up. As you know, we have 2 registrars, one Republican, one Democrat, in every town in the state. We somewhat unfortunately, I think, don't have a county level of government, which is where most elections are held, at a county level in other states. And we have taken a cautious approach to new technology. You should know that. We are not going for touch screens instead of paper ballots, for example. Some states did that 20 years ago when we got money from the federal government to get new equipment. Some states have electronic poll books where you get checked in on a little laptop. We have chosen not to do that here because those can be connected to the internet and compromised. We have an election management system, we call it, where the results are uploaded so you can see them pretty much instantly on our website. However, we don't allow the local officials to connect it to the internet. They have to type in the results by hand. It takes a little longer, but it's not risky. And we have been very risk averse in this state. That is not so true in all states, I have to tell you. So I feel good about where Connecticut is, and now I feel even better because our wonderful representatives in Congress have helped us to get another $5 and now maybe $10 million to upgrade our security on the voter file, particularly. Because the voter file, the list, is actually the only thing that's on the internet, and even that is not, it's not on the internet per se. There's a server in every town where the list drops down, and from that point, the town manages the servers. We are in charge of securing that information because that is all of your data. And that is the data we need to protect from any kind of foreign or domestic invasion. And this money that we have just received, thanks to Congresswoman Jahana Hayes, as well as the rest of our wonderful delegation, have fought hard to get that money released. It will make a difference, and we will be able to secure our voter file, not only at the state level, but also at the local level, which is frankly my biggest concern, because small towns don't have the resources to protect their own systems, and they don't have the resources to have the most updated version of Microsoft 10 or whatever we're running our servers on. So this is going to be a big help to us, and especially in keeping the faith of people in the elections. And that brings me to the one other thing I really, really want to discuss with you, almost more than the cybersecurity side of this, which I'm feeling pretty good. We're in a good place on that. But the campaign of disinformation that has been coming out of first Russia and now out of Iran and China and many domestic actors. Connecticut, exactly, right. And is what is propelling the problems we're having with elections today. And I actually brought some samples with me because we started seeing this, and as I said, I now have my security clearance, and I don't think it's breaching any confidence to tell you that I go to these meetings in Washington where they tell us about what they're seeing and what we need to be watching for. And as a result of this, the real thing I want is for you to be part of our army of people that are going to know this when they see it. Because without that, we will all fail. These are directly intended to put us against each other. And I didn't know it at the time because I don't go on these websites. But now that I'm going to these national meetings and they're showing me the kinds of things that not only influenced the 2016 elections, but are flooding the internet right now with all this disinformation about candidates, about campaigns, and about America itself. And it's very well funded. We're finding out literally billions of dollars are being spent primarily by the Russians on this campaign. And as one FBI guy said to us at one of these meetings, you know, it's a lot cheaper than building aircraft carriers and bombs. And it's working, and that's what scares me. So I'm going to show you a couple of these. There's lots more, and we can just pass them around. I didn't do a PowerPoint or any of that, but I just wanted to make sure you see exactly what I'm seeing.
Can you describe what it is?
Yeah, so here's one. This was during the 2016 election. There's one site calling Being Patriotic. And by the way, most of these sites are being put out by robots, bots. These are not even real people flooding the internet with this. And it says, Boston police shot and killed a man wearing body armor and wielding an assault rifle who critically injured 2 officers responding to a domestic disturbance. A gun battle raged in East Boston, and so forth. It says, another gruesome attack on police by a BLM movement activist. Our hearts are with these heroes. That's just an example of sort of inflammatory language being used to set us against, I didn't even know what BLM meant, but it's a Muslim group, I assume.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter, there you go. All right. Here's one, yeah, see, I mean, it shows you what I know. I'm looking for the one. Oh, here's one that's particularly pertinent to the things that are being said in Connecticut about illegal voting. At the heart of the question about voter fraud is a fear that undocumented immigrants, essentially, are voting illegally. Not to mention the fact that we have looked and looked to find examples and we can't find any because none of them have been reported at all in 20 years in Connecticut. But here's an example of some of the things that are being said to ramp up this sense that somehow the illegal aliens are taking over our elections. It says, this page is dedicated to protection against illegal immigrants. Like to join? We say no to illegal immigration. Stop AI community. And it has a picture of a guy in a Patriots hat looking very angry indeed about illegal immigrants. And then you have pictures like this. Hillary asks, what difference does it make? And it has a picture of a girl crying on a flag. And it says, follow Veterans US if you know the difference. Hillary Clinton will never understand what it feels like to lose the person you love for the sake of your country, honoring the high cost. This is specifically identified by the law enforcement officials as a bot led from a Russian IP address. And just to show you how serious this is, this morning I got up and I have a Gmail account, and Google sent me a message saying that a Russian IP address from Kazan, Russia, had attempted to enter my email, and they had my password. So I've apparently attracted attention somewhere. I don't know. Does this happen to you?
Every day.
Every day. There you go. So there's many more examples I could show you, some of them directly related to elections. Recently, of course, we have examples of this every day. Yesterday, the thing was, Drudge floats the implausible, a Bloomberg Clinton ticket. This is also a meme that is circling the internet. How many of you have heard of this possibility? Yeah, there you go. It's amazing how fast it spreads, and we're all guilty of spreading it because it's tantalizing. And so this is directly affecting our elections now, because what it does is it sets people against each other, and then we suspect everything. And I am terribly worried that whatever the result is of this coming election, no one's going to accept the results because they're going to think it's false, that something has occurred to make it unfair. And that's why I feel my job has never been more important, because it is my job to make sure people realize that, at least here in Connecticut, we're being fair and even-handed, and that this is handled by local election officials who, I have to say over and over again, are the real heroes in all of this, because they do it pretty much for the love of country. You don't get paid a lot of money, and they're on the job, and they now have to be certified and trained, which I feel strongly has made a difference in making sure everyone knows how to handle situations, because we want to be prepared on Election Day in case anything happens. So I think I'll stop there, and again, thank Congresswoman Jahana Hayes for helping us get the dollars we so desperately need to make sure that our elections are able to be performed fairly in Connecticut. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Secretary Merrill for that presentation. It's interesting because I've heard all of this before, but to hear it all together in one place, it really is astonishing. It's really great to be here. Every time I come here, there's always a huge crowd. You guys really turn out and are as my students used to say, woke about the issues whenever something happens. So I am your congresswoman. I was listening to you as you were talking about your credentials and how many years you've been at this. I've been at this exactly 1 year. But it doesn't take long. I guess what I would say on the issue of voter security and election security, one of the very first things that I encountered coming in was the release of the Mueller report. And there was so much information surrounding the report, but the majority of the attention was focused on volume 2. And I think what people forgot about was volume 1, which was unequivocal that the Russians interfered in our elections. It went line by line. In sweeping and systematic fashions, the Russians were successful at interfering in our election. And we really didn't have, I think, enough of a conversation about that. And they did it in 2 ways. One was through a sweeping social media campaign, just using bots and Facebook and different kind of ads and just saturating the airwaves with misinformation. And the thing that is concerning to me is that even when I'm in Washington, my colleagues will say things like, and this is why we should not use social media, or people should not get their information. Like it, don't like it. Social media is a part of our culture. So what we have to do is make sure that we are holding people accountable, that, you know, we've had many hearings in Congress with Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg has been in, and really asking those questions. How are you going to protect people's information? As members of Congress, we were all set up with social media accounts, verified accounts, and I get all the time, you know, you need to reset your password, you need to have a 2-step verification, and the House will always say, do not respond to those. We manage the accounts, but the fact that even as a member of Congress, there's a deluge of false information and attempts to get my password. The second way that the Mueller report outlined attacks on our elections was the hacking of emails. And we've heard so much about the DNC, the server, all of these emails, but that was an attempt to receive documents which were later leaked. And we saw little by little all of these documents coming out in an attempt to make people weary about the election process. And it worked. You know, we talk about, I think so many people, like the Secretary said, trust the process and believe that voting is our most fundamental right, and that is true. But we can't ignore the fact that some of these things have worked. And what I saw 2016 as was a precursor to what could happen, because we found over the last year, we've had several hearings and different members have been targeted, different states, and there were things that didn't work, but what it's been found is that these hackers said, okay, well, if we change this, or if we did this a little different, maybe it will work the next time. And I was astonished to see that Connecticut was on that list of states that there were possible attempts. I think, to the Secretary's credit, Connecticut had already done so much to protect and secure our elections, but there are states that do not have paper ballot backup. There are states that have not have gone completely electronic, who do not have the money, do not have the training, and I think that we're seeing that roll out now as we're looking at the caucus system. And it's a thing where our demographics have changed, our communities have changed. We have to figure out a better way to secure our elections. So we can't go all the way back 50 years, but going ahead too fast is not the correct approach either. The other thing that I've seen is just constant barriers to limit the number of people who have access to the vote. And this is, when we talk about in Connecticut, there's always campaigns about illegal immigrants voting illegally, and that has not happened. We haven't had any proof of it, but it's another thing to make people afraid. And those things that's immigration policy, not voting policy. What I've seen is that as we're taking votes in Washington, and I try very carefully not to be partisan on this issue, but the votes are very clear. You know, one of the first things we put on the floor was HR1, which was transparency in government, where you had to see where money was coming from, where things had to be reported, and my colleagues all voted against it. You know, any attempt to, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which was HR4, there's this idea that if less people vote, that we have greater control of the outcome. And my thing is, we give people access to the votes, and then it's up to the candidates to give a compelling reason to vote for me. Right. But there's this idea that if certain communities are targeted, and it's out of fear, because demographics are changing. We are always looking at election data, and when you look at the margin of victory in some areas around the country, you have areas where the margin of victory was very slim in the last election, talking about 10,000 votes. But then when you double down into targeted communities, you have 300,000 unregistered voters or 200,000 African Americans who did not vote. So you realize that if these people are allowed to vote, it would drastically change the outcomes. So there is constant disinformation in that way. And I think the other thing that I've seen is that the disinformation is festering. I've seen, I woke up a couple weeks ago to my phone's going crazy. I have 3 phones, and all of them are buzzing at the same time. And I look, and it was when the story of the Republican candidate for the seat that I currently hold was revealed in documents as being someone associated with the Ambassador Yovanovitch. And the thing is, what I've seen I had been dealing with just different disinformation coming out of different camps for months. And what I saw was that easily verifiable facts were not being verified, but just were being repeated over and over and over again, to the point where people were just fatigued. Or it seems like, and we looked, and you would see how some of these websites or social media accounts, one day they had 50 followers, the next day there were 10,000 followers. So it was clear that, there's some manipulation here. But just blasting out, just trolls, blasting out information, making comments, to the point where it was just fatiguing the people who were trying to hold down the integrity of the process. And I think that is a strategy. And that is something that we'll see over and over and over again moving into the process. And what I tell people, what we try to do a lot of is educate people about the process. Let people know. We've had people call our office about they're getting a mailer, and it looks like an official mailer, and it has information or locations. And you'll see, the box on the second page says paid for by so-and-so, but just not really understanding how to distinguish the real from the fake. And it's very difficult. We've had hearings on, you saw the video of Speaker Pelosi where her language was slowed down and slurred, but to the average person, there's no way to distinguish if this is real or fake. And we're seeing that happen over and over and over again. So what I always encourage people, we've been fighting really hard in Washington because states have these great ideas, but then they don't have the resources to do it. So we've been trying to bring resources back to the state so that local municipalities are not burdened with this huge task and the pocketbook of election security, because it's a much bigger issue than any small community can handle. And then the other thing is making people aware of where they should get good information. I did an event yesterday, and I always direct people back to the Secretary of State's website. If you want to know if you're registered, if you want to know what your polling location is, if you have questions before Election Day, there's a variety of resources to provide that information to you. What I found in the election in 2018, I recognized very early that in order for me to be in any way successful, I had to expand the electorate. I was going into a very just uncharted territory, a very difficult race for me. I had never run for any office before. Many people didn't know me, and I had to get out and appeal to people. I need you to register to vote. I need you to come out and show up to vote. And we hired election attorneys all over the state. We had about a dozen people just on hand to answer questions. And afterwards, the attorney said to me, usually we get 5 or 6 people who call with questions. He said, I couldn't believe that on the day of the election, we got over 200 calls from people in various places. And I really believe that that was due in part to the fact that I spent a lot of time just educating people about the process. If you do not have your ID, ask for an affidavit. If you are at the wrong location, ask them to send you to the right location. If the voting rolls have been purged and you're no longer on the rolls, you can still register same day by going to the registrar. And people followed through. So I really think that one of the things that we have to do in the next couple months leading up to the election is just educate people on the barriers. And so that if something happens, that instead of people going home and say, I was not allowed to vote, or I wasn't registered, or something happened, they'll know the right question to ask so that they can make sure that they are allowed to vote that day. And then I think the last thing I'll say is that the other thing is the use of absentee ballots. There's been so much talk about fraud and absentee ballots, but I know in a state like Connecticut, we have so many people who rely on an absentee ballot. I remember there was a woman who was on dialysis and I have to vote, and she needed a ballot. And we're hearing all these things in different states, how ballots are being manipulated. I still believe that in Connecticut, we have a very secure absentee ballot system. I think that one of the things that we have to do leading up to the election is let people know, how do you obtain a ballot? What do you do with it? You mail it in when it's completed, so that there is no impropriety when those ballots are being counted, because every single vote matters. When you're looking at, I follow elections in this district very closely, and last year we had some places, I think up in Washington Depot, the election was decided by like 12 votes. Or less. They did a recount, and I think it was less than 10 votes. So for all the people who think it doesn't matter, I know it matters because I'm sitting here as your member of Congress. So I really just appreciate the work that you're doing, making sure the information is out there. I used to say to my students something I called run to the roar. And there's so many people attacking the Secretary of State, and she's like, that's fine, I'll answer any question, it's like whack-a-mole. And most people would shy away from that criticism. And she's out in every community because the work is good. She's not afraid of any question. She'll, you're getting sued again, right? or there's always
Turns out that was a rumor.
Oh, okay. But there's always different groups who are just trying to attack the work that the Secretary is doing, and she is just steadfast in setting the record straight and putting out good information. And I just think that we have to be persistent in that approach moving forward, because it's going to keep happening. It's, for a small state, like for my district to pop up on the radar of an intelligence report, I was like, this is crazy, and I think for me, it was, initially I was incredibly sad, because I said to my colleagues, this is not what my district is about. We have fair elections, people work really hard, you do the best you can, and sometimes it's good enough and sometimes it's not, but we don't cheat. Not here. We don't cheat. Sometimes your candidate wins, sometimes your candidate doesn't, and then we kind of move forward. And that's not what's happening everywhere. So I just think that we have to just be mindful of that going in and protect the process. Yeah.
And that reminds me, now is the time I should tell you about what we're trying to do to combat all this misinformation. We have a new direct voter access program with our new texting platform. I don't know how many of you are into texting, but there is a way now.
Everybody's into texting.
I never want to assume anything. So you put in your phone, you text VOTER, and you send it to 474747. And you can get messages back and forth about the election. And so we're trying every way we can to reach voters where they are, I would say. We have our website, myvote.ct.gov, which tells you most of what you need to know if you have questions about how to vote, how to get an absentee ballot, and so forth. But I thank you very much for the compliment, and we are going to keep trying to reach people. Want it again? Yeah. Put in, you send it to 474747. That's the phone number, if you will. And then you put in voter, VOTER. I don't know, do you have to do all caps?
No.
No. All right. This is, by the way, Stephanie, who has created all this, being a nice young person who knows how to do all these things.
But I think the nice
Yeah,
thing is
right.
that there's multiple ways to
Yes.
get this information.
That's right.
And so there's the website, there's the texting app, we get print information. And can I see my phone for a second? Because I just got something this morning, I believe.
Text.
Yes, the Census Bureau announced this
Right.
morning that they're going to spend $500 million on ads about the census and voter protection. So there'll be TV ads as well around this. So I think that the idea is to just any available outlet to get the information out, because people get their information in so many different ways. And we just want to make sure that no group or community is left out because they didn't have access to good information.
And of course, you can always talk to your local clerks and registrars because they have the best information around about your particular election.
And our registrar is here. Is she still here? Marie, would you stand up so people know who will be making sure they're on the ballot? She has a partner, Joe Brucey, I think. He's the Republican. Yeah, he's the Republican registrar. So there are two, with two assistants, I believe, in the registrar's office in town. So they're the people you go to find out about your voting status. And if you have a question about whether or not you can vote and where you vote, that's the place to go. And it's on the website of the town, so you can find out all the information you need about voting. She even makes sure that you have information about absentee ballots, when they get filled out, when you have to submit them. So there's a wealth of information on that registrar voters website as well for the town. So I think it's time for us to ask a few questions. So what I'd like to do is, I'm kind of like the moderator of questions. So we have his question was, has there been a study to summarize the impact of the tampering that we uncovered?
So that's a great question, and I don't think there's been a study per se, but the Intelligence Committee has been working on it for over a year to see what was the impact, and voters were absolutely impacted. They looked at some key areas that were targeted and some key races that were targeted, and the number of people who either did not vote or had bad information or their vote was influenced by the ads that were sent out. I think one of the things that we run the risk of, because there's so many things going on, I hear people say all the time, that Congress should not do all of this investigating. It seems like it's harassment at this level. But I remind you that every day it's something new. And Congress has a responsibility. We have oversight responsibilities. And as these things come up, to do nothing is a dereliction of our responsibility. Congress has done these things. The executive has not. Even I would think that we would want to secure our elections on all sides, that everybody will want to make sure that this has happened. But the response is that this is an attack on the president, and it's not. This is an attempt to secure our elections. We've seen that in the last election, by design or default, there were places where the president benefited from the ads that were put out. The ads were specific to the Clinton campaign to damage the Clinton campaign. That's not partisan. That's just the facts. That's what the report laid out. It is what it is. But now it's being received as any attempt to clean up the process is an attempt to delegitimize the president. And that's not the case. We had an election. The results were secure. The results were confirmed, and Donald Trump became the 45th president of the United States. But after that, when we've seen all of these problems with the process, we have a responsibility to go and fix those problems before the next election. And that is being obstructed at every turn. But there are several committees in Congress that are working to make sure that for as much as we can, we are making sure this doesn't happen again.
Has there been any indication of subliminal advertising in campaign material in the last election? Or do we know of any cases of that?
Well, I'll just say, even though I have been at many meetings with law enforcement around these issues, I have not heard anything about subliminal messages. So I don't know if they're happening.
That's just it. You wouldn't
Right.
know.
Well, I think the law enforcement people are definitely monitoring a lot of this, and they would be looking for this, I guess, because somehow they uncovered it in the movie theaters. So,
If it's not illegal, why would they be looking for it?
well, because I have to say, quietly, behind the scenes, the states are working with the Department of Homeland Security to secure the election systems. In some instances, it's been counter to the public position of the administration. And so I very much value the work they're doing, honestly.
Oh, sure.
But I have to say, it has not come up, even in these top secret meetings, so I'll bring it up. I don't know. That's the answer. That's a very interesting question. And I didn't even realize that it's not illegal for election campaign ads. Wow.
Thank you.
It's
Can I
interesting.
just to follow up, some of it is not as subliminal as you would think. And much of it, the argument is always, this is protected by
Right.
First Amendment, freedom of speech. And when you get into the issue of campaigns, there's always this really fine line as to what is official and what is unofficial. But we see it now every day with, for instance, the use of the word socialist. It's one of those things where it's just portrayed so many times that it's getting into people's psyche, and people are beginning to question, policies or programs or things that they believe in as, but wait a minute, I don't want to be accused of being a socialist. I've seen in my own campaign and in my unofficial work, just images over and over with the squad. She's a member of the squad, and I'm like, they won't even let me in. Like, I don't even know. But if you repeat it enough times,
Yeah.
I'm not trying. I don't know why I made that joke, but it's just one of those things that at first it seemed silly, and then it was repeated over and over and over again, and it was like, do you not respond because you're wasting time, energy, and resources, but you're also creating this huge vacuum that people are filling with all this other information. So even when it's not as subliminal as just showing a Coke, there are things that are used, phrases, words, pictures that are used over and over and over again that are causing people to question things that they know to be true.
So the question is, has there been a movement for early voting in Connecticut?
To make it so that more people don't have to just vote on elections.
Yes, absolutely. Great question. The answer is yes. We keep bringing it up. There are now 39 states that have some version of early voting, and we are not one of them. Because it is in our state constitution that we're only able to vote on one day, and that's Election Day. So in order to join the rest of the states and allow people more opportunities to vote, we would have to pass a constitutional amendment. So last session, we did pass a constitutional amendment that would allow, I think it was 3 to 5 days of early voting in Connecticut, but it did not pass with 75%, which is what you need to get it on the ballot. It passed with 51%, arguably. I can't remember the exact percentage. We did not get any Republican votes for it in the House or the Senate. Well, I think we did we get one? I think we got one vote in the House, maybe two from Republicans. And in the Senate, I don't think we had any. But it is now on track to come up again. It has to come up in a second group of representatives and senators and be voted on again, pass again with at least 51%, and then it will go on the ballot in 2024. Right. So what happened was, because the Republicans blocked it, it delays it for another couple of years. But we're trying hard. It was, by the way, on the ballot in 2014 and failed. And I think it's mostly because people didn't understand what it said, because it was sort of worded in a kind of a negative way. It said, would you like to let the legislature decide if you get more days of voting? And you know how people feel about that. So I don't know why, but it did fail narrowly. And it took me 5 years to get on the ballot that time as well. So I was not happy, but we'll keep trying.
But again, it goes back to that original point.
Yes.
Why would we want to limit people's access to the vote?
Right.
And I think that's what we see over and over again. I think that once people are registered, then the candidates just have to work hard to earn their support. But the idea that if more people vote, or if we give more people access to the vote, or if we have more days to the vote, it's going to determine the outcome, that's a barrier that should not be there. Like the secretary said, 37 or 39?
39 states.
39 other states are doing it. And it really opens up access. And especially now, when we have these cycles where people's lives are just constantly moving. You have people who work nurses, 12-hour shifts. So if you think about it, if election day is only on this day and it's your day to work, it creates all of these problems, and people have to decide, do I go vote or do I go to work today? And that should not be the case in 2020.
Where do you go to get trustworthy information about the events or issues that we are presented with daily?
I would tell you where to not go. But the camera's rolling.
We can edit that.
I had to laugh because when you said you have the luxury of watching it as a retiree, I watched it in person and it was not a luxury. It was painful. But I also, having sat in the room, literally I flew in early, I stayed after, because I knew that I was going to have to take a vote that was a grave vote, and I wanted all of the information firsthand. So I sat, whenever I wasn't in a committee hearing, I sat during the testimony. And it was interesting to having sat during the testimony and then seeing the summary of the testimony afterwards, and I was like, that's not what she said. Or a little clip or a little snippet. But I think I would say the same thing that I would say to my students before. Get multiple sources of information. It was interesting. I would switch back and forth as the trial was going on, the testimony, and you would see one news station, breaking news, CNN, every 30 seconds there's breaking news, there's a different statement and different things going on. And then I turned to Fox News and they're talking about planning your next vacation. And I'm like, do you not know that there's a trial going on right now? But I thought about it. They have a viewership that's almost, I think, like 8 million people a day. So if you're someone and you're not changing the channel, then you're not even aware that all of these other things are happening. Right. And people have said to me, well, we have lives, we don't have, and I'm like, you don't think I have a life? So I had a group of young people say that to me yesterday. We don't have time to, but there's the way our system is set up, it requires active participation. It's not enough to say, I did not know anymore. And I think the way to do that is to have multiple sources of information. And it's such a crazy question, because you're like, well, what does that mean? I saw something on TV a couple weeks ago, and I called one of my staffers in DC, and I was like, turn on the TV. You have to watch this news report. And he said, oh, I don't have cable. And I'm like, what does that even mean? I said to him, then where do you get your news from? And he said, Twitter. And I was like,
Yeah.
I was
But that's right.
devastated, because I'm thinking, like, there are all these things happening in the world. If you're not reading a print newspaper, and even sometimes print newspapers, now we're at a point where one company owns all the newspapers in the region, so you really have to be intentional about diversifying where you're getting your information, by talking to people. And I think we've gotten to this point where people don't even want to talk about what they call politics, People say I don't get involved in politics, and I remind them every day. Every day, I take a vote on something that's going to impact your life. So if you choose not to be involved in that, it is to your detriment. But we're not having conversations. We're not having dialogue. You know, people who consider themselves friends are not even saying, well, actually, I watched the trial, and if you see the whole thing in context, this is what it says. So there's no conversation, which means that people on their own are just absorbing all this information and making these flash-in-the-pan decisions that are not true. So I would say, you know, it's going to require all of us to be intentional about seeking out reputable sources of information. And I think now something that I've never seen, and this cuts at who we are, these constant attacks on the free press is so incredibly dangerous. You know, the fact that we are talking about newspapers that are long established and attacking journalists, there are so many things. When you talk about the trial, much of the information that came out didn't come out through congressional hearings. It came out through investigative journalism, where journalists were saying, we were able to receive this. We did a Freedom of Information request. We found this person. When we start to just question the credibility of American journalism, that's a dangerous path to go down. And it seems like we're kind of blindly going down that path. And it's like, you know, 10 years from now, there'll be a different president, a different administration, whatever. But once we start to strip away at those core foundational principle and values, we never get them back. So I guess that was a really long way to say, do your research, find the information, and then when you find it, share it with someone who may not have the time to do that same level of research. But it's dangerous what is happening. These echo chambers are so dangerous.
Okay, so Jamie's question is about the national popular vote, whether or not it's possible to implement that.
Because I know it was passed here in Connecticut and in other states, like 15 already have already.
Yeah, the short answer is no. We need states to equal 270 electoral votes. So it's not the number of states, it's the number of electoral votes in those states that have to total 270 before it kicks in. And that is not possible before this election.
They're voting themselves out of business.
Right. And you're right, Connecticut has joined the compact, but only when it gets to the 270.
Barbara's question is there anything more that can be done to dispel the fallacy that illegal migrants, aliens, immigrants, undocumented are in fact voting?
I think the secretary has all the information, but just on a very basic level, if you are undocumented, the purpose is to stay undocumented. So
The whole thing makes no sense.
it just makes no sense. If you are here undocumented, you're not going to walk in and say, here's all my information and this is who I am. So it's the irony in that is
You're exactly right. We've been trying to counter this narrative for at least a decade now. And it persists despite a lot has been done to debunk it. And I did bring, actually, with me, because I had heard this was something being promulgated locally, a study that was done by several. Justin Levitt is one researcher that's worked on this. There's another guy out in California. They have done an exhaustive study across the country to find how many. Now, you have to be careful with this fraud word, too, because it can mean a lot of different things. But they looked at voter impersonation, which is, I think, what people assume it's about. Somebody comes in and pretends to be somebody else or claims that they're eligible when they're not. They found out of 1 billion ballots cast, 31 credible incidents, not proven, of some sort of voter impersonation. And I forget what the percentage is, but it's rather small. And so I'll leave this here in case anyone is interested in reading it, and you can find it online, of course. It was published in the Washington Post in 2014 when this was still coming around. And even the state, I have an article here where our election, see, I don't enforce issues of election problems. That's done by a nonpartisan election enforcement commission, where there are representatives from both parties and all kinds of other citizens. And there's a quote here from their director, Michael Brandy, that said there has been virtually zero incidents of voter fraud even brought, much less proven. And you always have to remember in these cases too, the only case, our office went back, because there was so much conversation about this, we went back 20 years to look at complaints that had been filed. And what everybody always forgets is that there's an intent issue. And the only instance we ever found was quite a long time ago, and it was a young lady at Yale who came from another country and assumed that she had the right to vote because she was going to school there. And she was never prosecuted, of course, because she didn't have the intent to defraud. So there's a whole issue around criminal law and these that people have to intend to do something wrong. But it's just another one of those things that people bring up to divide us, and it's been very successful. Because people say, well, of course, these people who are not citizens shouldn't be voting, and I completely agree. And then it comes down to, well, why don't they have a photo ID? What's the problem? I mean, we all have driver's licenses and passports, and we go on planes and they ask you for an ID. Well, but the truth is, a lot of the laws that have been passed in other states around these voter IDs make you use a very specific kind of voter ID. And that's the insidious nature of the kinds of things that are being talked about. For example, in Texas, they passed a voter ID law, and they listed the IDs you could use. And you could use your gun license because it had a picture on it, but you could not use your student ID, even though it had a picture on it too. So these are the kinds of little just insidious things that are done, and it's very similar to the poll tax issues that we had earlier last century, because that was the same argument. The argument was, well, it's $1. Everybody has $1. Well, guess what? Everybody doesn't have $1. They didn't in those days. It's the same kind of thing. It sounds kind of reasonable on the surface until you get down to the fine print. And then you realize it's definitely deliberately to keep people out. It is certainly not being done to facilitate voting. No. So I'm very happy with where we are in Connecticut. We have an ID law. Yes, you are asked to produce your ID, but it doesn't have to be a specific kind of ID. It's just to see that you are the person on that list. And that's the real purpose of it, because you've already presented ID to get registered to begin with. So I think if we can arm as many of you with this information as possible, and hopefully you have conversations with other people, that's the way information really spreads. Right. Think back to what I just asked you about this issue of whether Bloomberg might have Hillary Clinton as his running mate. Look how many of us already knew that. I go walking on Saturday mornings with a group of pretty much all retired people, and we go for breakfast afterwards at Panera's. The morning that this happened, somebody in our group said, "Did you hear Bloomberg's going to have Hillary Clinton as their running mate?" And I'm like, I hadn't read the paper yet. I'm like, where did you hear that? Well, on the internet, of course, So that's how fast things spread, even among ourselves. You all talk to other people. And Connecticut, I find, is still a small town state. We all talk to each other.
We have time for...
I just want to follow up on that. It's unfortunate because the issue of immigration is going to be probably one of the top 5 issues in the upcoming election. We're going to hear it over and over as the cause of every problem. And it's one of those things where, again, the fatigue will set in, not just around voting, but the economy, around education, around housing. It just keeps coming up over and over and over again in Washington. There's something called a motion to recommit, which is the last chance of the minority party to kill a bill before you vote on it. And the number of motions to recommit that have centered around immigration and our relationship with immigrants and our border security and financial security and all of these things, it's something that unfortunately will not only rear its head when we're talking about elections and election securities, but in every other aspect. So I always tell people, just brace yourself for that.
The question is there an effort on the federal level to identify sources of inaccurate disinformation and to help people?
We've been trying. Again, like I said, when Mark Zuckerberg came in, I think he's been in on more than one occasion, and there were these people are asking, when you find out that ads are fake or there's misinformation, you should have a responsibility to take them down. And he's flat out said no. I was very surprised after the story with Ambassador Yovanovitch and Les Parnas came out. Facebook took down, I think it was 5 pages that the individual from Connecticut had created, but not because of the content. It said because of procedurally the way it was set up was wrong, and that was just so outside of the norm, because generally they don't take down pages even when they're deemed to be fake. The information is deemed to be not credible. But it's a driver, it's an economic driver. You know, people are promoting these ads, putting billions of dollars behind them to get the information out, and it really is effective. When you're thinking about how much money you need to run a campaign, Connecticut is in the New York media market, so to go on TV is very expensive. But to promote a social media ad, you can do it for $100, you know, and put it out and just keep putting money behind these ads, and these companies enjoy the economic benefit of having no regulation. When social media was first launched, I think it grew faster than the regulations. So anybody can set up a page, anybody can call it anything they want. They are not held to the same standard as print journalism or even radio or TV, and really have just been left unregulated for so long. So there are attempts now to regulate the industry. Will that happen before the 2020 election? I don't think so. And the problem is further exacerbated by, again, any attempt to regulate the industry is seen as an attack or harassment on the current administration.
Thank you so much.
we get a picture with you and Rich and Denise?
Oh, sure.
This was great, though. I left a long time ago, but this was great.
Watched,
So you can just get a picture and then
all right, I'll be here.
Yeah, that's a Democratic Club.
all right, you can get it a little close. There you go.
There, is that good?
Yeah. Thank you.
Wait, just move over so that your picture's not upside down. This is wonderful. You take this so seriously. I know, but you're so